so thankful for our youth that have engaged in the service and been able to bring about Youth Sunday. I feel like there still is something that God will unlock with us today, that we have an opportunity to see a little bit more into this parable that Jesus taught. And this past summer, we took time to look at the parables that Jesus taught. And to be honest with you, we couldn't look at all of them because the primary way that Jesus chose to teach was through parables. And sometimes his disciples were even confused about why Jesus was teaching in parables. In fact, they asked him, "Why are you teaching in parables?" in Matthew 13. And this is what Jesus' response is. He says this, he says, this is why I speak to the crowds in parables. Although they see, they don't really see. And although they hear, they don't really hear or understand. So basically Jesus is saying that there are some deep truths in these parables, and we really have to kind of dig into them in order for us to find what those are. And I love that Jesus chooses to use stories to really entertain our imagination. And stories have this unique way of speaking to us, and for us to have an opportunity to learn something new that maybe a straight up teaching wouldn't really penetrate our hearts in the same way. And so as Jesus uses these parables to teach, I can't help but think about how stories are told even today. I mean, you think about these billion-dollar industries with movies and with TV shows, and how people invest so much time and energy into producing those, but also we invest our own time to hear these stories, to watch these stories. And in really good stories, you kind of think about, well, who am I in that story? You may have this other question that floats around your mind sometimes and has nothing to do with these stories, but you may think, how can a teenager sit in front of a video screen and play video games for hours upon hours upon hours? You know why? It's because there's a story that they're being called into, and they become a character in that story. And so they're actually seeing their life through this story, and that they're able to live into that story and change the outcome in that story. This is really essentially what Jesus does when he's using these parables, is that he calls us into the story to think about this important question: who am I in the story? So I'm going to ask you that same dangerous question when it comes to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who are you in this story? Now, in order for you to fully answer that question, I know what's going to have to happen. We're going to have to look a little bit deeper at this parable and to really take some time to clearly see what's happening in this parable so that you can truly evaluate where you are. You may read a parable and you'd be like, oh, it's a simple, short story, which they are, and they have a simple truth to them, which they do, but they also have some deeper truths. So reading this story in particular, you may say, well, it's a simple truth. It's just teaching us that it is nice to be helped. And although that is a true statement, it is nice to be helped, and I found that to be true in my own life, and you've probably found it to be true in your own life as well. Jesus is really teaching something much deeper in this parable. And so we have to be careful that we don't become those who hear the story but never really understand the story, because we never get to those deeper truths. So let me just set up why Jesus even tells this parable. There's this expert of the law who comes to Jesus and asks Jesus, well, what does it really look like to fully follow God? And Jesus' response to him is, well, you're the expert in the law. What does the law tell you about that? And he says, well, the law, it tells me to fully follow God is to love God with my full heart, my full mind, my full soul, and with all of my strength. And to do all of that and to love my neighbor as myself. And Jesus says, you're right. That is what it looks like, and that is what we're called to do, to fully follow God. And then the expert of the law, he asks this question. Yeah, but who's my neighbor? And I think he's hoping that Jesus' response would be like, oh, it's just whoever it's easiest for you to love. That's who your neighbor is. But Jesus doesn't respond in that way, and he tells this parable. And this is how the parable begins. There was a man who was traveling from Fernandina Beach to Jacksonville, No, that's not how the parable starts. It starts with there's a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. And if you were in Jesus' time, you would know, oh, that is a dangerous road to travel on. In fact, the commentator William Barclay, this is what he says about this road. He says, in the 5th century, it was called the Red or Bloody Way. In the 19th century, it was necessary to pay safety to the local sheiks. In the 1930s, people were warned to go home before dark if they intended to travel on this road. So everybody sitting around Jesus knows, like, oh, this is a dangerous road they're going on. And they can almost predict what's about to happen, right? This person who's traveling on this road, they get beat up and they get robbed. But what's bubbling to the surface here is something I think that we need to know. And what's bubbling to the surface is that we are called to help regardless of the why. Right? It would be easy to disqualify this victim because he got himself into the situation. Right? He traveled alone on the path. How dare he wear clothes that the robbers would want to steal from him? And that's kind of the first thing that we begin to see, is that sometimes we only help when we know the why fully. But what Jesus is calling us to do is to help regardless of the why. We begin to put ourselves into the story as we think about the priest who's coming by, right? The priest may be able to divorce himself from the situation and say, well, how dare this traveler travel alone on this road? But actually in this story, each of the characters is traveling alone on this road. And they should be able to recognize, oh, if I was to come here just a few hours before, I may be the victim that's sitting in the middle of the road in need of help. And so we begin to see that instead of divorcing ourselves from the person who is in need, we should be able to sympathize and see that, you know what? At some point, we will be that person in need. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about the priest is that we don't know what happens with the priest, right? I remember one time sitting in this room with these pastors. And so as we're having this conversation, one of the pastors says, oh, will you lead us in prayer? And so everybody, it was one of the pastors who had left the room. He comes back in after using the restroom, asks to lead us in prayer. We sit down, talk for a little bit, then we're supposed to pray. So we start the prayer, and it's completely silent. And it goes on for about 30 seconds, which is a really long time, to be honest with you, to sit in complete silence as everybody's eyes are closed and focused on the prayer that's supposed to be starting. Right? So after these 30 seconds, one of the pastors says, you're supposed to do the prayer. And the other pastor says, oh, I didn't realize that. And I said, oh, I thought he was just doing a silent prayer, right? And so I wonder if in this moment that this pastor, this priest who's walking past, says a silent prayer for this person who's in the middle of the road. Right? And maybe he does. Maybe he does say a silent prayer. But did he say the silent prayer as he walked past the good that God had laid out for him to do? Right? The irony here is that he's so occupied with going to worship God that he misses a chance to truly worship God. And this is what I want us to see in this first person who comes by, this first priest who comes by, is that our worship of God should never close our eyes to those in need. Rather, our eyes should be more open to the needs that are around us, the deeper our relationship with God gets. I've asked for a student to share from the perspective of the next two characters that arrive in the story, which is the Levite and the Good Samaritan. Student is a junior at Episcopal High School. His name is Joey Roberts.
Hi, I'm Joey Roberts, and I'm a student of the Episcopal School of Jacksonville, year 2025. So as I just said, I transferred to Episcopal when I was a freshman. Now, Obviously, when you transfer to a new school, there's a lot of news, and the stereotypical news, obviously, you have a new campus, new friends, new people to meet, new teachers, new classes, etc. And my transfer story, I'm not gonna lie, is pretty boring. Obviously, a lot of the stereotypical things, I made new friends, and all of these cool things happened, and I'm so blessed for the experience. But one particular person I met, who is a legend among the friend group, and now has become a legend among my own family, his name is Everett. Now, Everett is a like I said, very special guy. So for a physical description, Everett is 6'5", 215 pounds. Now, obviously, big guy, but here's where it gets fun. Everett is a redhead. Now, I'm not talking redhead like you can barely tell. I'm talking redhead. If my hair was Everett's color, it would be glowing and you wouldn't be able to see me right now. His eyebrows are blonde and see-through. And Everett also has the alpha male mentality. He doesn't like to talk to girls. He's always working, and if you're not working as hard as Everett, are you really working? He has straight A's, 4.2 GPA, but whenever you talk to him and some of the decisions you make, you really question how. He's a very interesting guy, and I'm not the only one who notices this. Now, Everett's, like I said, strong mental guy, so whenever he gets teased and made fun of, he can take it, obviously. But when that happens to you, it really does leave you to question, who can you trust? Now, Everett was in a situation that he has asked me not to share, but it left him not being able to trust his mom, his dad, or his family. In the perspective of Levi, they were too caught up in their own selfish ways. His parents wanted their own selfish desires. They left their kids and their family they were raising behind. Everett was stranded on the side of the road, trying to hold up his two younger siblings, and he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now, who does Everett call in this situation? Because he really doesn't know, because everyone pokes fun at him, but he doesn't really know who to trust. So he decides to call his short, loud, talkative friend, Joey. And thankfully, I've been very blessed to be the one who's with Everett through all of the thick and thin. And I feel like, and being someone who I would consider the Good Samaritan in the story, is always a good feeling. Now, the Good Samaritan is an iconic parable from Jesus. We all have heard it a million times, and we all have our own good parable stories. So whenever I was telling my family and friends that I was going to be doing this sermon about the Good Samaritan, they all had their own stories. Now, one of them stood out, and it was the parable from my grandmama. Now, a lot of you know her as Sherry. Now, grandma has I don't even know how it happens, but she has this ability, and I'm sure my aunt and my mom will vouch for this. She has the ability to, whenever she is sleeping, which she definitely does a lot of, whenever she wakes up, she is fully locked in and loaded. It's like she's been up for hours. When she wakes up, she's ready. And that's not an exaggeration. The other day, I had a blowout on my tire. I'm blessed that I'm okay, no injuries, but I had to get grandma's car because I have to drive an hour to get to school. So I knock on the door. I know she's not going to answer. I know exactly where she is and what she's doing. I walk inside just to make sure she's okay, but I can't just take her car keys. So grandma's in the den. The news is on her TV. She's passed on the couch. She's catching flies over here. And I obviously have to wake up grandmama because I'm not just going to take her car keys. What if that's a bad guy? So I take her cards and I knock on the window and say, "Grandmama." And then she perks right up and she doesn't even look at me. She gives her iconic greeting that everyone knows. Yes! Her iconic greeting, everyone, and grandma was right there and ready. Now, grandma used this superpower of an ability a few years back whenever my mom and my aunt were kids. So she gets a call late in the night, and this is a record-setting cold night. It was like 5 degrees or something. It's like 2 in the morning, and the police department calls them, grandma, and says, "Hey, there's this guy riding his bike to Michigan." Yes, a guy riding his bike from Florida to Michigan. I don't know. But he's riding his bike to Michigan. We were wondering if you could open up the Girl Scout hut for him. Why the police didn't deal with this, I don't know. Maybe they were too lazy, but they decided to call grandma up. And grandma, being grandma with her superpowers, she wakes right up and she's like, "Sure, I'll go do that." Grandma also has the consideration to bring food, heat up the place, and he lets the guy sleep there. He cooks for himself, and he's out on his way to Michigan the next morning. And he made it to Michigan, apparently, which is pretty cool. But in the end, grandma didn't even think about that it was 2 a.m. She didn't think about the fact that maybe I shouldn't do this. She thought, I need to help this person because this person is in the coldest weather we've ever experienced on this island, and he probably would rather me help. And she went and she did the right thing without even thinking. Doing the right thing without thinking is the main message of this parable. I think this parable too often gets caught up with the message of how poor people need to do the right thing and how rich people don't do the right thing. That's not what it's about. I think this parable is mostly about doing the right thing at all times. For example, there's a glorious man, obviously he's not perfect, he's not Jesus, but he goes by the name of Tim Tebow. Now, he's obviously a pretty cool guy, University of Florida grad. He won his 2 national championships, which is cool in itself, but which is even cooler is that he's a great coping mechanism for the current state of the Florida football program. Now, in Tim Tebow's Instagram bio, there's something I've never seen any other celebrity do this. He has over 10 million followers, and in his bio, he has his personal phone number. Do you realize how that is crazy to me? He probably gets hundreds of texts today, and then you'll probably, if you're at church, you'll see in the slideshow, but I texted Tim Tebow on his personal phone number, and he has responded, and he said that he would pray for my sermon, and he would make sure that he would get to it and pray for me. You know how much strength it takes for a man who has all these things, all these awesome stuff. He has all this money, and yet he still finds the time to pray for the short, loud kid at Episcopal School of Jacksonville. Is that not amazing? Tim Tebow takes the time to do the right thing. Now, Jesus, believe it or not, in his last days, I think we can put him in the shoes of the Good Samaritan. But the story has a little bit of a different twist. Now, in Jesus' last days, he was obviously falsely accused of all these things and crucified. But before this, the Jews were looking for the one Isaac promised, the Son of God, the prophet of man, the one who would save us all. And the Jews were expecting someone great, a king, a pope, a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the trial of high-ranking Jews that sentenced Jesus to death. They were expecting someone like that. Yet these people, just like Levi, passed right by them waiting. All these years, they saw the Pope pass right by them. They saw the rich Jews just using their religion to gain power, pass right by them. Yet when this Galilean Jew, someone who they considered impossible to be the Messiah, whenever he performed miracles, promised him being the Son of God, and preached the Word of God, they thought there was no way. So instead of this version of the Good Samaritan, where everyone passes by and there's someone here to help them, the man on the street who needs the help says, I don't want you, I want someone more. Now, the Good Samaritan in this situation probably should have moved on. And quite frankly, Jesus could have moved on. Jesus could have died on the cross and never came back. Jesus could have done anything he wanted. He was God. But instead of that, Jesus decides that he's going to come back and he's going to save us. He is risen from the dead. He comes back and he sends his Spirit down to make sure his kingdom reigns eternal forever. Instead of leaving us on the side of the street, which he probably should have done, he comes back and he saves us all forever. That is what doing the right thing always does. So if you're the man on the side of the street and you're looking for money or that car or that house, what you're really looking for is right in front of you. Jesus is always willing to take you into his kingdom. You just have to accept it. Amen.